A humble delivery man is forced to confront his dark past when a gang starts terrorizing his neighborhood. But as he uncovers a dangerous conspiracy, he realizes the truth is far more terrifying than he ever imagined. Will he survive the shadows of his past, or will they consume him? Carlos adjusted his helmet under the pale glow of a street lamp, his motorcycle rumbling softly beneath him. The dawn still cloaked the city in shadows as he navigated through the labyrinth of narrow streets. Delivering packages was not glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept him under the radar. That anonymity was crucial. The city was alive even at this early hour, a symphony of honking horns and muffled voices blending into the hum of urban chaos. Carlos moved seamlessly through it all, his focus sharp, his movements precise. He prided himself on efficiency, every turn, every stop calculated. It was a rhythm he had mastered, but today the rhythm was off. As he crossed into a busier district, a sense of unease prickled the back of his neck. Checking his mirrors, he noticed a black sedan trailing him. It was subtle at first, maintaining a steady distance, but it never turned away. Carlos kept his face impassive, his hands steady on the handlebars. He couldn't afford to show any sign of suspicion. For several blocks, the car continued to follow. Was it a coincidence? Or something more? He forced himself to breathe evenly. Overreacting would draw attention, and attention was the last thing he needed. Carlos decided to test them. At the next intersection, he veered sharply onto a side street, weaving through alleys and cutting across empty parking lots. Yet when he glanced back, the black sedan reappeared, its headlights glowing like a predator's eyes in the distance. The tension mounted, a quiet storm brewing inside him. He considered pulling over, confronting whoever was behind the wheel, but that would be reckless. Instead, he focused on his route, sticking to his schedule. Delivering packages wasn't just a job, it was his shield. Acting normal was his best defense. Arriving at his next stop, a small cafe tucked away in a quieter part of town, Carlos dismounted and pulled the package from his bag. He scanned the area discreetly. The sedan was nowhere in sight. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. Experience had taught him that danger often lurked where you least expected. Inside the cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft chatter of early risers. Carlos handed the package to the barista, exchanging a polite nod. He lingered just long enough to blend in before stepping back outside. The morning air felt colder now, heavy with unspoken threats. Mounting his bike again, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His eyes darted to the reflective windows of nearby buildings, searching for any sign of movement. He spotted two men standing across the street, their postures too deliberate, their gazes too focused on him. They weren't trying to hide their interest. Carlos started his engine, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning bell. The men exchanged glances but didn't follow. Not yet. He didn't need to see their faces to know they weren't ordinary bystanders. Whoever they were, they wanted something from him. As he merged back into traffic, Carlos replayed the morning in his mind, analyzing every detail. Was this connected to the incident last week? Or was it something else entirely? He clenched the handlebars tighter, his instincts screaming at him to stay alert. By the time he reached the next delivery point, the city was fully awake, its chaotic energy masking the danger that loomed in the background. Carlos forced himself to focus, suppressing the turmoil within. He had spent years perfecting the art of staying invisible. Now, that carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, and he couldn't afford to let it shatter. Carlos arrived at his next delivery point, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The area felt eerily still, the kind of silence that made even the faintest sound seem amplified. He parked his bike near an old rundown house, its peeling paint and sagging roof, a stark contrast to the gleaming towers of the city center. Pulling a small package from his bag, Carlos stepped onto the cracked pavement. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. He glanced around, instinctively scanning for anything out of the ordinary. The unease from earlier still lingered, like a dark cloud hovering just out of sight. As he approached the door, the sound of footsteps broke the stillness. Carlos froze, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Turning slowly, he saw three men emerging from the alleyway, their movements calculated and deliberate. They spread out, blocking his escape route. At the center was Rico, a man with sharp features and an air of smug confidence. "Hey, delivery boy," Rico called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Carlos remained silent, his eyes darting between the men. They were clearly part of a gang. Rico's tattoos marked him as the leader, while the others carried an assortment of weapons. The tension in the air was palpable. "I don't want any trouble," Carlos said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just here to do my job." Rico chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Trouble? No, we're just here for a little contribution. You see, this is our neighborhood, and anyone working here owes us a fee." Carlos's jaw tightened. He knew this kind of shakedown well, but paying them off wouldn't end it. They'd keep coming back for more. He had tried so hard to leave his past behind, to live a quiet life. Yet, here it was, clawing its way back to the surface. One of Rico's men stepped forward, brandishing a knife. "Hand over the cash or things get ugly." Carlos took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The logical part of him screamed to comply, to avoid escalating the situation. But another part, buried deep, began to stir, the part of him that had been trained for moments like this. The man lunged, his knife aimed at Carlos's chest. In a blur of motion, Carlos sidestepped, his hand shooting out to grab the attacker's wrist. With a twist, the knife clattered to the ground. Before the others could react, Carlos delivered a swift kick, sending the man sprawling. Rico's smug grin vanished. "Get him!" he shouted. The remaining two rushed forward. Carlos ducked under a swing, his movements precise and fluid, as if choreographed. Years of training, long suppressed, surged back into action. He grabbed a makeshift weapon, a broken pipe lying nearby, and swung it with calculated force. The clang of metal against bone echoed in the alley. Rico, now alone, hesitated. His confidence wavered as he watched his men groaning on the ground. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Carlos didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes cold and unyielding. Rico raised his hands in a defensive gesture, but Carlos didn't strike. He leaned in, his voice a low growl. "Stay out of my way." With that, Carlos turned and walked back to his bike. His hands trembled as he gripped the handlebars, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He didn't look back as he sped away, leaving Rico and his men in the dust. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but it felt like an eternity. As the city blurred around him, Carlos's mind raced. He had exposed himself, his past, his skills, and he knew it wouldn't go unnoticed. Carlos slammed the door of his small apartment behind him, the sound reverberating through the cramped space. He leaned against it, his chest heaving as the adrenaline from the encounter finally began to subside. The silence of the room wrapped around him, but it offered no comfort. His mind raced, replaying every detail of the fight, every movement, every strike. He crossed to the sink, splashing cold water on his face. As droplets ran down his skin, his reflection stared back from the cracked mirror, a face he barely recognized. The man he'd tried so hard to bury was clawing his way back to the surface. He clenched his fists, the tremor in his hands betraying his carefully composed exterior. Carlos moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. It was quiet now, the chaos of the city distant and muffled. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His instincts, honed over years in the shadows, told him that this was far from over. He sank onto the worn couch, his head in his hands. Memories he had fought to suppress surged forward, unrelenting. Flashes of a different life, missions in foreign countries, targets neutralized with precision. Orders followed without question. He had been a ghost, a weapon wielded by unseen hands. But that life had come at a cost, one he wasn't sure he could ever fully repay. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him back to the present. The screen displayed a message from his delivery app, a routine notification about his next shift. He stared at it, the mundanity of the message almost absurd after what had just transpired. But normalcy was his shield, his camouflage. He couldn't afford to abandon it now. As he stood to prepare for the next day, a sharp knock at the door froze him in place. Carlos moved silently, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he kept hidden under the couch. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Relief flooded him when he recognized the elderly landlord, Mrs. Ortega, standing there with her usual frown. "Mr. Carlos, your rent is due," she said, her voice muffled through the door. He exhaled slowly, opening the door just enough to pass her an envelope of cash. "Sorry for the delay, Mrs. Ortega. Here you go." She eyed him suspiciously, but said nothing, shuffling away down the hall. Carlos closed the door, bolting it tightly. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now, not ever. Across town, Rico sat in a dimly lit garage, nursing a split lip and a bruised ego. His gang members, battered and humiliated, sat silently around him. The air was thick with tension. Rico slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing off the metal walls. "This isn't over," he growled. "That guy thinks he can mess with us? He's got no idea who he's dealing with." One of his men, cradling a bandaged arm, spoke up hesitantly. "Boss, are you sure? That guy, he's not normal. The way he fought—" "I don't care," Rico snapped, cutting him off. "We're taking him down, and we're gonna make him pay." Rico's anger wasn't just about revenge. His defeat had caught the attention of someone higher up, someone he didn't want to disappoint. A shadow loomed in the background of the gang's operations, one that had been content to stay out of the spotlight. But now the shadow stirred. Carlos sat back on the couch, exhaustion creeping over him. He had no way of knowing what Rico was planning, but he didn't need to. His reaction during the fight had already sealed his fate. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the night deepened, Carlos stared at the ceiling, the ghosts of his past swirling around him. He had fought so hard to escape that world, to build something simple and honest. But now, the cracks were showing, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it all together. The next morning brought a brittle calm, the kind that felt like the city was holding its breath. Carlos rode through the streets on his motorcycle, the routine of deliveries grounding him. But something was different today. The usual noise of vendors and pedestrians seemed muted, replaced by furtive glances and whispers. The unease was palpable, creeping through the community like a slow-burning fuse. As he approached a familiar cafe to drop off a package, he noticed the shattered glass on the sidewalk. The once busy storefront was now eerily empty, chairs overturned, tables broken. The owner, Mr. Rivera, stood outside with a defeated expression, his hands trembling as he swept the debris. Carlos dismounted, concern etched on his face. "What happened here?" Rivera looked up, his eyes weary. "The gang," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They came last night, said it was a warning for everyone." A cold weight settled in Carlos's chest. He didn't need to ask which gang. Rico's bruised ego was playing out in acts of violence, and the community was paying the price. "They can't keep doing this," Carlos muttered, more to himself than to Rivera. Rivera sighed, his shoulders sagging. "What can we do? We're just trying to survive." Carlos didn't respond. He handed over the package and mounted his bike again, his mind racing. As he continued his route, the signs of Rico's retaliation became more evident. Graffiti scrawled on walls, small shops vandalized, whispers of beatings in the alleys. The gang was sending a message, and Carlos understood it all too clearly. They were baiting him, forcing him to come out of hiding. At the delivery hub, Anna noticed his distracted demeanor. She was a sharp observer, always quick to pick up on the moods of those around her. As Carlos organized his packages, she approached, her voice low. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her tone probing but not intrusive. "Something going on?" Carlos hesitated, his instinct to deflect warring with a growing sense of guilt. The attacks on the community were his fault, even if indirectly. But could he risk pulling Anna into this mess? He glanced at her, noting the genuine concern in her eyes. "Just tired," he replied finally, forcing a half smile. "Long nights." Anna didn't look convinced. "Well, if you need to talk or anything else, let me know. I've got your back." He nodded, grateful for her support but unwilling to let her deeper into his world. As she walked away, Carlos's thoughts churned. The guilt was becoming unbearable, a weight pressing down on him. Innocent people were suffering because he couldn't keep his past buried. Rico wasn't just targeting him, he was making a spectacle of it. That evening, Carlos rode through the neighborhood again, this time not for deliveries. He wanted to see the damage firsthand, to understand the scale of what was happening. At every corner, he saw fear. Families locking their doors early, shopkeepers nervously glancing over their shoulders. Kids kept inside instead of playing in the streets. He stopped at a small convenience store run by an elderly couple he had known since moving to the area. The door was broken, the shelves overturned. Inside, the couple huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Carlos clenched his fists. This wasn't just a gang flexing its power. It was a deliberate campaign to break the spirit of the community. and it was working. As he rode back home, his thoughts turned dark. He had spent years trying to build a life free from violence, but violence seemed to follow him like a shadow. Avoiding it had been his way of surviving, but now it was costing others their peace, their livelihoods. That night, Carlos sat alone in his apartment, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Rico and his gang weren't going to stop unless someone made them, and as much as he hated to admit it, that someone would have to be him. Carlos spent the next morning perched on the edge of his bed, his gaze fixed on the cracked paint of his apartment wall. He had replayed the events in his mind countless times, the broken shops, the frightened faces, the shattered calm of a community that had once been his sanctuary. The decision weighed heavily on him, but there was no alternative. The time for avoidance was over. The smell of coffee wafted through the air as Carlos moved to his desk, pulling out a worn notebook. He flipped to an empty page, his pen poised. Years ago, plans like this had been second nature, mapping routes, assessing risks, predicting moves. That life had left scars, but it had also equipped him with tools he could no longer ignore. First, he needed information. Rico's gang was merely a surface-level threat, a symptom of something much larger. Carlos had seen it in Rico's eyes during their confrontation. The fear, the desperation. Rico wasn't acting alone. He was taking orders, likely from someone higher up, and Carlos needed to know who. Ditching his delivery gear for the day, Carlos roamed the neighborhood, moving through its maze of alleys and corners with practiced subtlety. He listened carefully to the whispered conversations of shopkeepers, the hurried exchanges of teenagers hanging out on stoops. The gang was on everyone's lips, their grip tightening with each passing day. By afternoon, Carlos had pieced together a pattern. Rico's operations centered around a network of warehouses scattered across the city. They weren't just running protection rackets. They were moving something bigger, something dangerous. Drugs? Weapons? He couldn't be sure yet, but one name kept surfacing in hushed tones: La Mano Negra. The name sent a chill through Carlos. It wasn't new to him. During his years in the shadows, he had encountered whispers of the organization, a sprawling, elusive network that operated in the dark corners of society. If La Mano Negra was involved, this wasn't just a neighborhood turf war. It was a carefully orchestrated move in a much larger game. Returning to his apartment as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carlos reviewed his findings. He spread a map across the table, marking the locations of the warehouses he had identified. His plan was forming, a series of precise, strategic strikes to disrupt the gang's operations without endangering innocent lives. He would dismantle their network piece by piece, forcing Rico to show his hand. Carlos knew he couldn't do this alone. As much as he hated the thought of dragging anyone else into the fray, Anna came to mind. Her offer of help lingered in his thoughts. There was something about her, an edge, a quiet strength, that hinted at a history as complicated as his own. But he wasn't ready to involve her just yet. For now, he would move alone. Under the cover of darkness, Carlos began his reconnaissance. He visited the closest warehouse, a hulking structure near the industrial district. From a rooftop across the street, he observed the comings and goings of its occupants. Men loaded crates into unmarked trucks, their movements hurried but coordinated. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons a stark reminder of the danger Carlos was stepping into. As he watched, Carlos's mind flicked back to his training, the instincts that had once guided him through missions far more perilous than this. He felt the old rhythm returning, the quiet confidence, the sharp focus. It was like slipping into a second skin, one he had thought he'd shed forever. The hours ticked by, and Carlos sketched out his plan in the notebook. He would start small, targeting the gang's resources to sow confusion and chaos. Each strike would bring him closer to the heart of their operation, closer to the truth about La Mano Negra. As dawn approached, Carlos returned home, exhaustion tugging at him but unable to override the resolve burning in his chest. He stared at the map one last time before folding it neatly and tucking it into his bag. This was no longer about self-preservation. The gang had crossed a line, and Carlos was determined to push back. Carlos sat perched on the rooftop of a derelict building, the cool night air brushing against his face. Below him, the gang's warehouse buzzed with activity. The dim glow of industrial floodlights illuminated the yard where men moved in and out, loading crates onto trucks. Their movements were sharp, efficient, and heavily guarded. It was the kind of operation designed to intimidate anyone who dared interfere. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, ensuring its contents were secure. Tonight was the first step. His plan wasn't about brute force, it was about precision. Years of training had taught him that a targeted disruption could unravel even the most organized networks. Carlos waited until the guards changed shifts, a brief moment of chaos as men rotated positions. Using the cover of shadows, he descended silently, blending into the dark like a specter. He moved with purpose, slipping past the patrolling guards and positioning himself near a stack of crates marked with an unrecognizable logo. Inside his backpack were small, homemade devices, tools he'd put together from parts scavenged over the past week. With practiced ease, he planted the devices at key structural points around the yard. They weren't designed to destroy, merely to send a clear message. Carlos worked quickly, his mind sharp despite the pounding of his heart. By the time he slipped back into the shadows, the devices were set, their timers ticking silently. From a safe vantage point, Carlos waited. The seconds dragged like hours, each one amplifying the tension in his chest. Then the first explosion, a controlled blast that shattered a stack of crates, sending debris and smoke into the air. The sound echoed through the industrial district, followed by shouts of panic from the gang members below. The guards scrambled, their voices rising in confusion, as more explosions erupted in sequence, each one targeting a strategic point. Lights flickered, and the air filled with the acrid scent of burning materials. The chaos was total. Carlos watched as the gang members frantically tried to assess the damage. He could hear their leader barking orders, his voice strained with fury. Rico wasn't there. This wasn't his domain. But his men were rattled, their bravado shaken. It was exactly what Carlos had intended. Satisfied, he melted back into the night, his retreat as silent as his approach. The first strike had been a success, but it was only the beginning. The gang would regroup, and their retaliation would come. Carlos needed to stay one step ahead. Back at his apartment, Carlos meticulously documented the night's events in his notebook, noting the gang's response times and vulnerabilities. His hands were steady, his mind clear. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control, a reminder of the man he once was. The next day at the delivery hub, Anna approached him again. She had noticed the subtle changes in his demeanor, the sharper focus, the quieter intensity. This time, she didn't hold back. "You're up to something," she said, crossing her arms. "Don't try to deny it." Carlos hesitated, the weight of his secrets pressing against him. He had kept people at a distance for so long, but Anna's piercing gaze made it impossible to deflect. Finally, he sighed, lowering his voice. "Let's just say I'm trying to fix a problem," he admitted, his words carefully measured. Anna raised an eyebrow. "A problem that involves Rico's gang?" Carlos's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know about that?" Her expression didn't waver. "I pay attention, and you're not the only one who's dealt with people like them." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Carlos studied her, noticing the subtle confidence in her posture, the way she carried herself. There was more to Anna than met the eye. "I'm not going to ask for details," she said finally, her tone softening. "But if you need help, I'm here." Carlos nodded, a small gesture of gratitude. He wasn't ready to involve her yet, but the offer lingered in his mind as he walked away. Later that night, Carlos sat by the window of his apartment, staring out at the city. The first strike had been a success, but the war was far from over. As much as he wanted to keep Anna out of it, he couldn't shake the feeling that she might already be involved in ways he didn't fully understand. Carlos paced the narrow confines of his apartment, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Anna's words from earlier replayed in his head. "You're not the only one who's dealt with people like them." It wasn't just the way she said it, it was the certainty in her tone. She wasn't guessing, she knew. And that knowledge hinted at a past as tangled as his own. The knock at the door startled him. Carlos approached cautiously, his knife tucked discreetly into the back of his waistband. Peering through the peephole, he saw Anna standing there, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. He opened the door halfway. "Anna, what are you doing here?" She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her gaze sweeping over the sparsely furnished room. "We need to talk," she said, her tone firm. Carlos shut the door, watching her carefully. About what? She turned to face him, her eyes sharp. About whatever mess you're in, and don't bother lying. I've seen the way you move, the way you act. You're not just some delivery guy trying to scrape by. Carlos stiffened, his instincts screaming to deflect, to deny. But something in Anna's expression stopped him. She wasn't accusing him, she was leveling with him. For the first time in years, he felt the fragile possibility of trust. You first, he said cautiously. What do you know about Rico and his gang? Anna hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line before she exhaled sharply. I know they're small time. The real threat is who they answer to. La Mano Negra. The name sent a jolt through Carlos. He stepped closer, his voice low. How do you know that? Because I used to work for them, Anna admitted, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. A long time ago, before I left everything behind. Carlos's mind raced. It made sense now. The confidence in her movements, the way she had picked up on his own habits. She wasn't just observant, she was trained. You were an agent, he said, more a statement than a question. Anna nodded. And so were you, I'm guessing. Carlos didn't respond immediately, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he said, I walked away years ago, thought I could stay off their radar. Anna let out a bitter laugh. You don't just walk away from La Mano Negra. They find you sooner or later. Her words hung heavy in the air. Carlos leaned against the table, his mind piecing together the implications. If La Mano Negra was already pulling the strings behind Rico's gang, then his recent actions hadn't just caught the gang's attention. They had painted a target on his back for the organization he had spent years avoiding. They're after you too, Carlos said, his voice tinged with resignation. That's why you're here. Anna's expression softened, a hint of vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. I recognized the signs when the gang started escalating. This isn't random, Carlos. They've been watching you, waiting for you to surface. Carlos shook his head, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted a normal life. Normal doesn't exist for people like us, Anna replied quietly. We're ghosts, Carlos, shadows of what we used to be. Her words struck a chord, and for a moment, Carlos felt the weight of his own denial. The life he had tried to build, the routine he clung to, it was all a fragile illusion. He couldn't escape who he was. What do they want? Carlos asked finally. Anna's gaze hardened. You. La Mano Negra doesn't let go of its assets easily. And from what I've heard, Lorenzo, their current leader, has been looking for someone like you. Carlos's blood ran cold. Lorenzo. The name carried a weight of its own, a figure shrouded in infamy within the organization. If Lorenzo was involved, this wasn't just a local issue, it was personal. What do we do now? Carlos asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Anna squared her shoulders, a determined glint in her eye. We fight back, together. Carlos hesitated, the idea of teaming up with Anna both reassuring and terrifying. But he knew she was right. Alone, he could only do so much. Together, they might stand a chance. Then we start with Rico, Carlos said, his jaw tightening. If he's their pawn, he's the key to getting to Lorenzo. Anna nodded. Agreed. But we have to be smart about this. No mistakes. Carlos met her gaze, a flicker of hope breaking through the tension. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. The dimly lit bar reeked of stale beer and desperation, a perfect hideout for men like Rico. Carlos and Anna moved through the smoky haze, their presence barely noticed by the patrons hunched over their drinks. In a booth near the back, Rico sat nursing a drink, his bruised face a testament to their last encounter. Carlos approached silently, his every step deliberate. Rico glanced up, his body tensing the moment he recognized him. You've got some nerve showing up here, Rico sneered, his voice low but laced with unease. Carlos ignored the jab and slid into the seat across from him. Anna remained standing, her eyes scanning the room for threats. Her mere presence added weight to the tension, her calm demeanor as sharp as a drawn blade. We need to talk, Carlos said, his tone flat. Rico leaned back, attempting to mask his nerves with bravado. Oh, now you want to talk? After blowing up my operation and roughing up my guys? Carlos's gaze didn't waver. Your operation isn't why I'm here. I want to know about La Mano Negra. At the mention of the name, Rico's confidence faltered. His hand tightened around his glass, the subtle tremor betraying his fear. I don't know what you're talking about. Carlos leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "Don't lie to me, Rico. I know you're working for Lorenzo. I want details. What he's planning. Why he's after me." Rico hesitated, his eyes darting to Anna, who stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The weight of their combined presence bore down on him, forcing him to reconsider his defiance. Finally, he sighed, setting his glass down. "Look, man, I don't know much. Lorenzo gives the orders and we follow them. That's how it works." "Then why does he want me?" Carlos pressed, his voice hardening. Rico's gaze shifted nervously. "You're valuable. That's all I know. Lorenzo's been talking about bringing you back into the fold. Says you're one of the best they ever had. He's been pulling strings, making sure you show yourself." Carlos exchanged a glance with Anna. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was far more sinister than he'd imagined. "What's Lorenzo planning?" Anna asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Rico hesitated again, his fear palpable. "He's got something big in the works. Smuggling routes, new alliances. I don't have the full details, but he's building something. And he wants Carlos on his side for it." Carlos's jaw tightened. Lorenzo wasn't just hunting him for revenge. He wanted to use him as a tool, a pawn in whatever scheme he was orchestrating. "Where can we find him?" Carlos demanded. Rico shook his head vehemently. "I don't know, man. Lorenzo doesn't share that kind of information. Even I don't see him directly. He's got layers of people between him and the street-level guys." Carlos studied him for a long moment, weighing his options. Rico was scared, but fear alone wouldn't ensure his cooperation. Carlos needed leverage. "If you want to stay alive," Carlos said finally, his tone cold, "you'll help us. When Lorenzo comes calling, you feed us the information. If you don't..." Anna stepped closer, her presence a silent threat. Rico swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But you'd better keep them off my back. If Lorenzo finds out I'm talking to you..." "That's your problem," Carlos interrupted, standing. "We'll be in touch." Without another word, Carlos and Anna left the bar, the heavy air of tension following them out into the night. As they walked to the motorcycle, Anna broke the silence. "You think he'll cooperate?" Carlos started the engine, his expression grim. "He doesn't have a choice. And if he doesn't, we'll deal with him." Anna nodded, climbing onto the bike behind him. The war with La Mano Negra was escalating, and they were running out of time to stay ahead of it. But with Rico in their pocket, they finally had a chance to strike back. Carlos and Anna moved through the shadows, their steps synchronized, as they approached the heart of La Mano Negra's operations. The warehouse complex loomed in the distance, its gates heavily guarded. Inside, Lorenzo and his most trusted men were gathered, plotting their next move. This was it, the final confrontation. Carlos's heart pounded in his chest, his mind sharp with focus. He and Anna had spent days gathering intel, preparing for this moment. Every step had been calculated, every risk weighed. There was no turning back now. As they neared the perimeter, Anna signaled for him to halt. They had to act quickly and decisively. With a single glance, they communicated everything. No more games, no more distractions. Carlos's plan had always been about precision. They disabled the outer security system with practiced ease, slipping inside before the guards had a chance to react. The compound was eerily silent, the hum of machinery the only sound. With one last look at Anna, Carlos nodded, and together, they stormed the heart of the operation. The final assault had begun. The air inside the compound was thick with tension, the quiet hum of machinery interrupted by the echo of their footsteps. Carlos and Anna moved swiftly, avoiding the scattered guards as they navigated through the maze of rooms. They had one goal: Lorenzo. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a large steel door at the center of the complex. Beyond it, Carlos could sense the presence of the man who had orchestrated everything, the mastermind behind the chaos that had torn his life apart. Carlos turned to Anna, his eyes meeting hers. They had come this far, but neither of them could be sure of the outcome. "Are you ready?" Anna nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We finished this." With a single motion, Carlos kicked the door open. Inside, Lorenzo sat at a large desk, his back turned, unaware of the storm that had just arrived. "I've been expecting you," Lorenzo said, his voice calm, almost amused. Carlos stepped forward, his hand tightening around the gun at his side. This ends tonight. The confrontation was swift, brutal. In the end, Carlos stood victorious, but at a cost. Lorenzo was defeated, but the weight of the decision still lingered. As they walked away, Carlos felt the burden of his past crash down on him. He had exposed himself, forced to confront the man he used to be. With one final glance at Ana, he spoke the words that had been building in his chest. "I can't stay here, not anymore." Ana's eyes softened. "I understand." Carlos turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving behind the only life he had known. In the end, Carlos had to make a choice between running from his past or facing the consequences head-on. His decision wasn't easy, but it serves as a reminder that no matter how hard we try to leave our past behind, it will always catch up with us. The question remains, when confronted with our darkest moments, do we hide or stand and fight? How would you have handled Carlos's dilemma? Click on the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and reflect on the choices you would make in a similar situation. Don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories. And thank you for joining us today. See you in the next video.